All right, well, let's get started with our presenter today. I'm very excited to introduce you, Colin Seale. He is the founder and the CEO of ThinkLaw, and we are just thrilled that he was able to launch us today with his discussion on equity case for prioritizing gifted education at a moment of reckoning. How are you today, Colin?
I'm doing all right. How about you?
Doing pretty good. Just trying to hang in there and navigate what's going to happen with schools opening and closing, and who knows what's going to happen. So it's been interesting for sure.
I
So,
definitely can relate.
so that being said, how have you and your family been coping through school closures and the quarantine?
I think like everyone else, I think really like everyone else, you try to be that silver linings person of like, oh well, there's always the bright side of things, and then at a certain point you're like, it would really be nice to social distance from these people. Like I just want these people to be at least 6 feet, if not 60 feet away on occasion. But you count your blessings. Us in our immediate household have been able to stay healthy and find a way to make it work. But we're all kind of, I think every parent right now is in the same very similar struggles. So, you know, keep it pushing.
I understand. Yeah, we've got 5 kids between my fiance and I here. So every once in a while, I'm like, okay, you guys can take your very active personalities and go find your rooms for a little bit. Gets a little bit crazy. So, how do you maintain your focus during all the chaos?
So I think a big part of what I do, and this is something that actually comes back to being a gifted child who often struggled with, dealing with things like this and times like this and these kinds of turmoil and challenges. Um, Remembering that I'm not actually doing this alone. Like remembering that there are people that I can reach out to. So where I might have taken a lot of social interactions for granted because I'm always traveling and going to conferences and interacting with folks, I'm like, well, you kind of have to plan that now. You have to like make a
Right.
space for it and be very intentional about it. So I've been forcing myself to be much more intentional about the way that I connect with people close to me.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's so important to do that. And I think it's really given a lot of us just a new way to look at things, like with working from home and just it's definitely bringing to light a lot of different ways that we can go about our day-to-day business and handling relationships with the people that we work with and our families. So it's definitely been very eye-opening. So, well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I am going to turn the floor over to you, and hopefully you'll be able to share your screen.
It's not letting me. I did sign on as a
Oh,
panelist, right? The one you gave
okay.
me.
I might be frozen.
Give me a second here. Okay. All right. So as you're waiting for this, I had a chance to kind of see where a lot of you all were chiming in from. It looks like everyone here that did chime in say that they were joining us from Arizona. I just want to make sure that I'm correct. Is there anyone here who's not joining us from Arizona, from a different state, who's just out here because they just want to do the absolute most and be student of the month and teacher of the summer or somehow just overachieving? All right, so we're all here in Arizona. That's great. As I had dropped in the chat a little bit earlier for some of you that didn't see it, I'm actually here in Glendale. So I'm feeling the heat. I'm in the same sort of situation where we're looking at these crazy spikes and dealing with the delay from what we saw with school starting and having a lot of skepticism about what all this is going to mean. At the same time, a lot of anxiety about how we're going to, work this out from a perspective with my children. But here's kind of what I want to start with as we're waiting and trying to be able to share my slides more formally with you all. I want to start with actually just kind of jumping to two questions that I had. And the questions that I have might not seem all that obvious with the idea around the equity case, talking about why gifted education matters at this moment. But I want to pose you a question like Family Feud style, all right? So I want y'all to rock with me Family Feud style. I'm gonna ask you to just put your answers in the chat. And if you could do on your little pull down, put it to all panelists and attendees so that everyone can see your response, all right? Family Feud style, I want you to pretend that you are there trying to get big money with the number one answer. And here's the question I'm gonna ask you, all right? We can see gaps all day, every day, right? We see gaps separated by race. We see gaps separated by, poverty. We see gaps separated by, whether or not students are English language learners. So whatever the case is, whatever gap we're talking about, I want to ask you, why do you think the number one answer, tell me the number one answer that you believe that achievement gaps based off of race and socioeconomic factors that have been around for 50 years are still there? Why do we think those gaps still exist? So go ahead and just drop your answer. Like, what do you think the number one answer? So some of y'all thinking it's early education. Look, y'all going all the way to the root cause. Teachers are not shifting up there, adjusting the curriculum for students or whatever have you. There's not enough opportunities. So some people say, forget achievement gap altogether. We're going to call this the opportunity gap. So, maybe there's some things around low expectations. Maybe there's some things where there's not enough rigor. So like, I want to step all the way back. All right. I want you to hang on to this question for a second. And I want to go all the way back to this beginning slide. And I want to kind of introduce myself with that question in mind. And I want you to think about what I just did. The very first thing that I did is I asked you to tell me something. Okay, don't forget that. The very first thing that I did is I asked you to tell me something. Tell me something that you knew. Tell me something that showed me that you came in with assets. You came in with knowledge and experience and values and know-how. And I asked you to share that as part of our learning space to start with, okay? So a couple of things, just so you can kind of keep track and follow along as we go through this. So if those of you that like to engage on Twitter or Instagram, want to follow along that way, please feel free to add me to your Twitter at Colin Seale. On Instagram, it's Colin Seale. The middle initial actually matters because my little brother is also named Colin Seale. My dad is also named Colin Seale, and clearly he had some issues. So make sure you get that initial right. And on Twitter or Instagram, if you want to follow my organization, you look that up at ThinkLaw US. My website is thinklaw.us. My email is colin@thinklaw.us. And a little bit about kind of why we're here is this is no longer some sort of ugly stepchild issue in education. This is no longer an issue on the margins for, oh, okay, like a would-be nice sort of thing. This is mission critical. Now I'm going to explain why this is the goal and where and why I'm in this space. So a lot of the work that I do with ThinkLaw, where we help educators teach critical thinking using real life legal cases in older grades, using fairy tales and nursery rhymes in younger grades, and doing a lot of trainings just like this with parents, with teachers and school leaders. And right now we're working with schools in about 35 states. A lot of this originates when I was young. It comes from the point of being very young, being in a kindergarten class where I was getting in trouble all the time, moving to a very tough section of Brooklyn, New York, where I was at a school in first grade where I was getting in trouble at least once a week, just mouthing off at the teacher and just belligerent, right? Always defiant, always getting in trouble for being defiant, always getting in trouble for getting out of my seat and being disruptive. But this class right here at PS 208, this was a classroom at a school that I got bused to, okay? And this was a transformational experience for me. And I want to kind of break down this picture for you a little bit, okay? Because when I say transformational, I don't think you know what I'm talking about. You probably looking at this picture and you're thinking, wow, like, look at Colin's sweater. Colin's sweater game was clearly on point. He clearly seemed to fit in with the whole Bill Cosby trend or whatever was going on in the early 90s when it came to sweaters. Apparently, Colin's mom was very concerned with flooding, because why else would she put him in such high waters? But what you don't know about this class is you don't know that not only were we all busted this class, not only were we at this part where, you know, this is a 4th/5th grade class, where only 12 kids per grade level had access to this class. So we were in this school, where within the school, we were receiving a separate and unequal education. To add to that, when I say transformational, I'm trying to say that the same behavior I used to get in trouble for was now required. Let me make sure you understand what I'm saying. The same exact behavior I used to get in trouble for was now what was required. Now, me mouthing off with the teacher was being inquisitive, not defiant. Now, me getting out of my seat and interacting with my peers, that was collaboration. That wasn't me throwing a whole class off course and being disruptive. But here's what gets me about this picture. It's a stern reminder that so often genius is distributed equally, but opportunity is not. And when I think about this opportunity, I think about this idea that my wife and I, who both grew up in poverty, who both grew up on kids and free and reduced lunch, in one generation, have been able to end intergenerational poverty in our families. So she is a professor at Arizona State University. I'm sorry, Tucson folks and the U of A folks. We shouldn't go there. She just teaches. It's her job, okay? It's how we pay the bills. I'm sorry. So, and I think about our family unit, where I've been able to get my degree in computer science and be a math teacher, work in child welfare and graduate at the top of my law school class, and now have this organization where we're doing ridiculous stuff all over the country. I'm always shocked. I'm shocked that our kids are doing amazing things. My daughter, Rose, is 7 years old. Let me tell you about my daughter, man. My daughter, like, she skipped over the 1st grade. And if you look at her, you can probably tell who runs our household. My son, Oliver, this kid cracks me up. Every single day, he comes to tell me, like, Daddy, I have a question, but he never has a question. He always wants to tell me his trials and tribulations and give endless commentary. I think he's ready for education conferences. I think he's ready to be that person at education conferences who never has a question, but wants to actually be a panelist. Anyhow, I look at this family, I look at where we're at, and I have to be honest with you. It doesn't usually go this way for kids like me. It doesn't. When you grow up on free and reduced lunch, as the first generation of your family born in this country, because my mom is from Barbados, and we struggled. I lived in a neighborhood where there was a lot of gang activity. We struggled. I was a kid that had behavior challenges and had issues in high school. We struggled. My father was locked up for a decade for selling drugs. We struggled. And yet, I had access. I was lucky because I had access to excellent educational opportunities through a gifted and talented program in a city, New York City, that had so few gifted and talented programs available. I lucked out. And because I lucked out, I can now say things like, oh, well, I guess I'm the exception to the rule, but I don't want that. I want to create a world where the rule is that every kid has a fair shot at becoming exceptional. I'm sick of looking at test scores that are low and gaps and all this stuff. And I think that's why I wanted to start here. I wanted to start here and have this conversation around equity, around access, around gifted education and why we should prioritize it. And I wanted to start it here with standardized exams, because I think the answers you gave were all pretty much on point. There were a lot of like really thoughtful responses there. But are y'all ready for round 2? I got one more round of Family Feud for y'all, just real quick, okay? So indulge me in this. Again, you're looking for number 1 answers. Don't be getting buzzed out by saying some random stuff. Number 1 answers only, all right? So here we go. Now we're asking Arizona teachers a different question. What is your biggest frustration when it comes to test prep? And again, make sure that you have it set to go to all panelists and attendees so that everybody sees it, okay? What is your biggest frustration with test prep? So we talk about wasted time, they talk about people not respecting the test, the idea that we have to do it at all. Christy's like, well, why is this even a thing? Who even knows that these tests are actually valid? It doesn't seem to always tie to curriculum. It's like, now I'm teaching and the next week I'm actually going to teach to the test. And it's like, all we do is like obsess over the test. We're not actually looking at the individuals and what their kids are at. And you know what? Like, I want y'all to get this out. I want you to like lay it all out. Lay it all out. Lay out all that funk and stink. Like, lay it out, okay? And then after you lay it out, I want to stop you all, okay? I want to stop you and I want to give you a different perspective. I kind of live in the world of different perspectives. And the part of the reason when it comes to the test that I'm this way is I do not believe that you can come to this work with an equity-based mindset and teach kids like me who are all throughout the state of Arizona and all throughout the country and realize or not realize that tests might not be the be-all and end-all to education, right? There might be flawed. They might be racially biased. There might be a ton of reasons that these tests are very questionable, right? But if we're honest about something, we might change our mindset about this just a little bit. I want to be honest about something. We live in an unjust society. This moment of reckoning around racial justice in this country has maybe opened up eyes to people that might not have seen things before. I think the COVID-19 pandemic shined a pretty bright light on some inequities that were always there. But if we're being honest with ourselves, and this is something that I go through a lot in this piece that I wrote for the 74, when you look at kids like me, it's still part of the unjust society that we're in, that we have to work twice as hard to get half as far. Like, here's the thing about me. You might not know this, but I don't have an Aunt Becky. My mom is not Felicity Huffman. No one's gonna lie and say that I was on a crew team. No one's gonna donate to some building so that I can get an admission or a free ride here. No one's gonna like get the hookup so I can get this job over here. My credentials need to be impeccable. I want to go even further to you all on something, okay? In law school, I scored in a 95th percentile on my LSATs, all right? As a law student, okay, I was teaching and going to law school at the same time. I was #1 in my class. I was on the Law Journal. I had already won some awards like as a law student before I graduated. #1, okay? I had 13 on-campus interviews. As a student in the top 10%, you get invited to interview with the top law firms in town. How many job offers did I get from those 13? As the top student with this blazing resume who's on Law Journal and already winning awards? I happen to also be the only African-American law student in the top 10%. I got one job offer. Why did I get that job? Because I had an inside. I actually knew one Black attorney at that firm who was able to put in a good word for me. And he didn't even live in the state. He lived in a different office. So I want to be clear about something. In a world where we have to go twice as hard to get half as far, we've got to be honest about the role that tests play. So thinking like a lawyer. I told you about my daughter. I told you how she runs my house. My daughter is 7 years old, right? And the other day, she's on Amazon. And she comes to my computer. She's trying to do something. She's on Amazon. And she's like, Daddy, how's your book doing on Amazon? And she looks and I was like, oh, okay, yeah. Oh, the book is doing good, Daddy. How many books did you actually sell? And she went and she looked. And I was like, babe, it's not going to be the right number because people buy directly from the publisher, whatever. And this girl, do you know she had the nerve to be like, oh, you sold 542. Oh, okay. And that's like that's the whole world. So that's it in the whole world. And I'm like, if you don't get out of here, Like, why don't you write a book? Out here talking trash. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up actually is for a real important reason, right? So we talk about like effort and equity, and we say test prep doesn't matter, right? So I was curious. I'm like, so if Thinking Like a Lawyer is number 5 in gifted students education, what are the other books that people are buying in this category? And apparently people like cursive and they like unicorn handwriting. And I was shocked and appalled to realize that my wife had actually bought this unicorn handwriting book for my daughter. I'm like, don't you want me to win? Don't you want me to move up in this ranking? But anyway, what about the rest of them? And here's where it gets interesting. You see those like really bad circles that I made? These are all the different books in the top 30 on Amazon that are test prep related books. So whether we decide as educators that we're going to give our kids that extra leveling up, there's other kids out there that are leveling up. There's other kids out there that are like teaching to the test on their own or cramming to the test on their own. And we know these tests aren't perfect. But if we care about access, if we care about equity, we've got to understand that there's a playing field that is already out of whack. And I hear this all the time, right? I always hear people say when we start talking about representation issues, they're like, well, look how many Black players are in the NBA. You don't see people complaining about representation and equity there. And I'm always like, but here's the thing. A basketball hoop is 10 feet tall. A rim is a certain diameter and circumference. It is what it is. It's standard. So if it's standard and we all play on the same court, like the rules are level. We're playing in the game. Do you see this slide? It's not level. It's not level. So if we think about it, if we look at what's already happening here, if you look at the reality that our kids have to work twice as hard to get half as far, we've got to recognize that for kids like me, there's an essence there. I think about in my grandmother's house, when I was in first grade, I was in my grandmother's house in Brooklyn, and there were up to 9 people in this house at any time. I say house, it was really a 1-bedroom apartment, okay? And I think about this. I think about being in this space, and I wonder, I knew how to play a mean tambourine, but what if that was it? What if, like, I didn't have teachers that were like, you know what? I'm gonna make sure that like y'all kids in this class right here, we're gonna push you so that we can set the stage for you to have excellent opportunities going forward. So here we are, these random kids in Brooklyn, who by the time we are in 7th grade, we're taking the equivalent of Algebra 1. We're taking 8th grade, we're taking Algebra 2, geometry. And people are looking at us like, who are these random kids that are doing this stuff? Because they decided to level us up. They decided to really push us and dig in to our success. And the reality is, the case for critical thinking has never been stronger. The case for making sure that our kids are where they need to be has never been this important. So when we start looking at this, I talk about this so often. I talk about what critical thinking is in terms of skills, right? The ability to reason, the ability to think about your own thinking. We also talk about the habits and mindsets of critical thinking, which we call your critical thinking dispositions. How likely is it that you're going to apply critical thinking throughout life, academics, and career? And we also talk about the idea that we can no longer live in a world where it's okay to have a kid that says, I'm going to write until my hand starts hurting, but I don't do math. Right? It's got to be something that we're applying across different contexts. But here's where we start going off, ladies and gentlemen. Here's where we lose it. Will any of y'all agree that right now we are having a crisis when it comes to anti-intellectualism? Just give me a quick yes or no in the chat. Anti-intellectualism crisis, do we have one? Yes or no? I hope y'all are saying yes, because it seems to me that the more data you present to people, the less they believe you. You got your data, I got my Facebook memes. So there's a bigger picture here. There's a bigger picture here, and I want to blame us, right? As collective, as educators. I want to blame us for part of this problem, because part of this is our fault. We have let it got to a point, we have let it get to a point where so many of our public intellectuals are absolute jerks. They are nasty. It's not enough for them to be smart. They have to make you feel stupid. I'm going to give you a quick example of this. My daughter, once again, and I promise she's a sweet lady. She's a sweet little girl, and we're working with her, and she's sweet, and she's precious and amazing. But one day, I'm doing dishes, and I'm like, hey, Rose, can you pass me the cup that's on the table? She's like, Dad, there's no cup on the table. I'm like, Rose, come on. Like, the cup's right there on the table. Can you please pass it to me so I can wash it out? Dad, there's no cup on the table. I see a glass though. Man, I turn off that sink so fast and I walk up there and I'm like, listen to me. You are not going to be one of those kids who knows exactly what I'm talking about. You find some minor technicality and you use that to make me feel stupid. Because you do stuff like that, you're not going to have any friends. And I realized, at what point do we spend so much time preparing our kids to be right that we fail to teach them the importance of doing right? Any amens? Do y'all agree with this? Like, we spend so much time on being right that we don't actually break down the importance of doing right. So if we realize that, like, critical thinking isn't just a process, it's a process with a purpose, and we can actually, like, even in 2020, say it's part of my job to, like, raise kids to be kind and, like, good and nice. Like, I think that means something. If we're honest about it, like, the people who engineered the Holocaust were critical thinkers. So, like, it's not just that I want kids to be critical thinkers. Like, I want them to be able to do this towards a purpose that actually is truly intended to better society. Now, we can disagree on the methods or whatever have you, but I want to kind of drill this in, that doing right is more important than being right. And this matters a lot when it comes to these equity sorts of conversations. So here's the reality. We know where we're at. And I know that in a lot of ways, this is part of the conflict that gifted and talented teachers in particular have when it comes to test prep and issues related to it. Because we know that in many ways, this isn't the kind of future our kids are even preparing for, right? We're talking about like nanotechnology and automation, artificial intelligence, and it's like, so we supposed to just sit here doing AZ merit stuff? But I'm like, at the same time, if they're able to get at the mastery level, if they're able to like write their own ticket into the best high schools and the best programs and the best summer opportunities, like, we change the game. We're allowing them to level up, and these things really matter. So this is part of the whole kind of thinking like a lawyer framework that we came up with. And the whole point is, there's some things I just have to reject outright, okay? I don't rock with college isn't for everyone, because I know the power of college within certain minority groups in particular, with women in particular, and I'm not buying it. Literally, it still pays to go to college, so I'm not buying it. If you want to see some of my analysis, I wrote an article about this. And it's not just about like college for the sake of going to college. This actually goes even deeper than that. If you look at the types of professions, with the exception of, medical related stuff, of course, the type of professions that allow people to actually work from home, it's much more likely if you have a college degree. So not only is your career more resistant to economic downtimes, which it's true, like college degrees is the biggest predictor of having minimal impact in the recession back in 2009 and in the current pandemic related employment crisis right now. But like, it can literally be a part of increasing your risk of like living or dying. Like, this actually matters. So if we start going through this a little bit more deeper, if we start really thinking about this why and why we're focused on this, I want to break something down to you. Remember I told you that these kids were brilliant kids from South Brooklyn who were bused? They were bused to this school. Do you know that in this class of 24 kids, 3 of us didn't graduate from high school? Make sure I'm hear what you're saying. Hear what I'm saying. These kids are the most brilliant kids. We were so brilliant that they had to bus us to this special school, the special classroom in the school. And 3 of them did not finish high school, not college, not grad school, not med school, not law school, high school. We left genius on the table. And I was very close to being the 4th. I was very close to being a fourth, despite the fact that in 8th grade, I was like in a National Honor Society. I was double accelerated in 2 different subjects. What went on? Well, I kind of looked into it. When I looked back at my pictures in 9th and 10th grade, it was so interesting because I had the same pose in every single picture. I wasn't a rapper. I wasn't making a rap album, but every single picture I had was posing for an album cover. And I started realizing, like, man, I just stopped caring. Like, man, like I just really struggled. And eventually I pulled myself out of it. And I spent a lot of time helping parents that are dealing with the same issue in some of the workshops that we do with schools. But it's deeper than that. It's actually deeper than just I was struggling with I don't care syndrome. I think when we had the equity conversation, we spent a lot of time in gifted education talking about identifying kids of color. But we don't necessarily talk about what it means to make sure that they're successful when it comes to gifted programs. I can tell you, there was a major shift. And some of you probably see this, because I imagine that most of you that are on here are doing gifted in K-8 spaces. And gifted programs in high school, we don't necessarily even call it a gifted program. We say things like AP. Oh, okay. Oh, dual enrollment. Oh, okay. But dual enrollment isn't gifted. Like AP isn't gifted. And what happened with me, in a lot of ways, their high school program was just harder, faster, more. It wasn't gifted. It was just harder, faster, more. And harder, faster, more didn't really rock with a kid like me because it was just very different. Okay, so this was in 9th grade. This is at a time when like I was having to go to this really nerdy high school. And I say nerdy like I wasn't a nerd. Of course I was a nerd. But these kids just were nerdy for no reason. They just did all that stuff, whatever. And I just wasn't that kid. But I don't know. I think it's different. Listen to me. I think it's different. And I appreciate Jenny's comment that the disconnection of our students is on us. Let me talk about this for a second. I spent a lot of time blaming myself, but now I wonder, maybe it wasn't just me. So a lot of reasons why I talk right now about critical thinking as a pathway to racial justice, which means to me, not just figuring out a way to continue to prioritize, fund, and expand gifted programs, right? I'm talking about doing things like local norms and universal screening and talent development in kinder, 1st grade, so that kids aren't seeing critical thinking types of problems for the first time when they're taking the COGAT or the Negler or whatever have you. But leveraging those same exact strategies so that all kids get access to critical thinking. Because listen to me, and I think this is a phrase that we gotta like make sure that we know as like advocates as of gifted students. Like, it is not true that all kids are gifted, okay? And that's not like a bad thing to say. Like, not all kids are gifted, but there is not a single child who would not benefit from the type of instructional strategies that work with gifted children. And if we decide that we're not gonna give all kids the chance to up their level of critical thinking, then that's not justice. That's not equity. So I want to see districts looking at gifted education as a strategy for school improvement district-wide. You show me your toughest district, you show me the highest priority for where every single one of those teachers should be trained and certified in gifted and talented teaching strategies. Because if they've got that, they'll know how to pull, they'll know how to connect, they'll know how to get kids rolling and rocking, okay? So as we are clearly preaching to the choir, let me break in a little bit of other stuff here as well. When I get to this point where I talked about this moment where I was struggling and I had missed 80 classes my freshman year and I just was failing multiple classes. I didn't even go to summer school, even though I failed. I just really did not care. I realized at a certain point that maybe it wasn't just me. Maybe it's us. And by us, again, collectively within education. And it really wasn't until I started speaking out about this and asking and thinking about, like, why is it that kids who are brilliant, like I went to the Bronx High School of Science. We graduated 9 Nobel Prize winners. Neil deGrasse Tyson graduated from my school. And you've got one of the few Black kids sitting in your class where the sole criteria was a test that I passed. And somehow they just watch me fail. Somehow they just watch me do nothing and miss absences and go months without submitting an assignment. Well, Maybe they took out a book on gifted underachievers, because this is from a book on gifted underachievers. And I thought it was interesting. Do y'all see what I see with the different caricatures of the different types of underachievers in gifted education? I don't even want to name the book, to be honest with you, because do y'all see what I see? What do you see in this picture about gifted underachievers? They don't look like me. They don't look like a lot of the kids y'all serve in Arizona. So I started thinking about that, and I'm like, okay, well, maybe that's just a coincidence, right? And I was speaking to someone who happened to be a cabinet level official in a district here in the Southwest. And she told me something. I'm in her office and we're talking about gifted education in her district. And she's like, do you see above my wall? And I looked at it and I was like, I did think, this happened. Sorry about that. My screen just kind of scrolls. I did, hold on a second. I did think, looking at her thing, that, oh, that's weird. You have like a school like certificate that you got at some point when you were younger. And I looked closer and she's like, yeah, like one day when I was in 4th grade, our teacher gave out awards to every kid in the class. And she's a Latina. She was the only Latina in her gifted class. And you want to see the award that they gave her? They gave her the award for asking the most stupidest questions. And this teacher had the entire classroom sign off on it. So I looked at this, and I remember being in this office and feeling like very emotional looking at this. And to think about, like, she would put this up in her office as a reminder of the power of what educators can do to potentially crush souls. And like, here's the thing, like, not only is this feeling of like being invisible in the eyes of like underachiever and whatever have you, being ignored, right? As like someone who's struggling, even though I clearly have potential. But if I'm showing my potential, then like I'm being ridiculed by you as my educator. And I want to bring up a quick story. Like, being from Brooklyn, one of the things I love the notorious B.I.G. Biggie Smalls, one of my favorite rappers. He passed away when I was in high school. And I remember it just hit me. It hit me like a month ago that like Biggie's first album, his first single on his first album, before the album even came out, it was a song called Juicy, right? It was a song that like, it was a banger. People love this song. He just signed to Puff Daddy and Bad Boy Records. This is the high point of his life. His mom was Jamaican. He's the first generation of his country. He dropped out of high school and he's finally made it. He's finally made it. He got the record deal. He got the single. Do you know what Biggie Smalls said? The very first set of words on his first song, on his first album. Do you know what he said? This guy actually said, this album is dedicated to all the teachers that told me I'd never amount to nothing. That's the first words he said. That's the very first words he said. This is a guy who's clearly brilliant, putting words together and thoughts together. I mean, this guy is someone who rappers even today look up to. Like, I can't believe this guy was so gifted in the way he could put words together. And the very first thing he would say is, I'm going to dedicate this to the teachers that said I'll never amount to nothing. And I think about this and I realize, what is the point of all this? What is the point of why I think leaving genius on the table is such a massive equity issue? It's another line that Biggie says, where he says, my mind's my 9, my pen's my Mac 10. My knowledge is powerful. My knowledge has the potential to break down unjust systems, to dismantle injustice. Like right now, like I'm playing the game, but the whole point of playing the game is to slay the game. So if I start thinking about this within the context of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and all of these issues that we're seeing, where we're questioning like whether like Black lives actually matter, and finally get into a moment where I think people are realizing like, yeah, like We need racial justice. What happens very often is we get to this next step where we start saying things like, okay, you know what we should do? Let's make sure we do more training around implicit bias, even though I personally think a lot of issues are actually explicit bias, but whatever. And we start talking about like different kind of curriculum that we can use that can reflect our kids better, and doing more restorative justice, and like making sure that we understand the trauma our kids bring to the table. And honestly, to some extent, all these things need to be there, right? All these things are helpful parts of like what it takes to be able to reach and have impact with children. But at the same time, I want to make sure you understand that what a lot of educators call trauma, a lot of students call Tuesday. And on top of that, I want to have a higher standard. I know how powerful minds are. There's a reason that Biggie said, like, my mind's my 9, my pen's my Mac 10. And if I really want to go further, if I want to get to the point where I'm like, you know, stop killing us can't be my motto. I'm sorry, it can't be. It can't be. Like that's not enough. At the end of the day, what am I alive for? If I'm just surviving but not thriving, that's not me. That can't be the point. So as I start going into this, I've got to realize, like, if Black lives matter, so must Black minds. So must the minds of our ELL students. So must the minds of our kids in poverty. So must the minds of our kids that are in reservations, or our kids that are native, that are living in cities and other areas. We've got to make sure that we understand that there's more here. So if I'm talking about educational equity, I'm integrating it. It's not just a standalone thing where I'm doing a bunch of workshops about race. I'm recognizing that academic success is part of that justice. The outcomes are the equity. And I'm going to fight tooth and nail for those outcomes. Hear what I'm saying? I'm not talking about opportunities. I'm talking about outcomes. Opportunity is a cop-out. Okay? Like, I can't say that I gave you the opportunity, you just didn't take advantage of it when the kid's in 2nd grade. That's on me. I gotta push. I gotta push a little bit harder. I gotta work with the family a little bit more. No excuses culture for me is no excuses for the adults in the system. So when I think about this, okay, when I start thinking about this and put this together, and I'm actually having an event next week where I'm talking about this, I'm doing a book signing that's themed around this idea of the educational equity equation. We gotta do both. We gotta make sure that we're doing the disruption in ourselves. We're giving our kids the tools of disruption, but we'll also recognize it. Our kids still have to work twice as hard to get half as far. The more marginalized our children are, the more the outcome is gonna matter. So like, I want you to like kind of mark your calendars for this. Again, if you text the word think to 66866 and respond with your email, you get a link for this. And I'll also send you a little handout summarizing this presentation later. I just did this like a few hours ago, so I don't have that handout yet, but I want to make sure that you all have that on your calendar to take a look at. So as we kind of wrap up and we get to a point where we start asking questions, I want to bring up one last slice here. Someone made a comment earlier, and as I was scrolling through a lot of ideas, and we talked about like cultural norms as being a barrier to academic success. And what I think is important that we do is we make things a little bit more explicit and connected, where true, sometimes traditional measures of academic success might seem like they're not valued, right? But the reality is, almost every single parent wants to have a better life for their children than they had for themselves. And sometimes the lack of valuing certain aspects, or our idea that there's a lack of valuing of it, could be that we just don't have as much information. Like, they might not understand what it actually means to get there. And what I want to really break down with you all right now is that before I was sitting in a law school class, graduated top of my class, or sitting in a courtroom on some big case, they held court in the barbershop that I grew up in. Granted, it wasn't talking about the law, but it was talking about who's the best NFL team or basketball player or the prettiest movie star. But like, they would make the case before the jury of their peers that were waiting to get a haircut. And I learned the power of persuasion. And I learned like about, you know, ethos and logos and all these different ways to philosophize before I read a letter from a Birmingham jail. So at the same time, the basketball court on Flatbush Avenue in Brooklyn at the YMCA, I went there about 2.5 years ago. And I played for about an hour and 45 minutes, and I didn't even break a sweat. Why didn't I break a sweat? Because every 5 minutes, there was a full-out jury trial. Was that a foul? Was that not a foul? Was that a travel? Was that not a travel? And I realized there was such a demand for evidence. You telling me we couldn't have used that as an English teacher? You telling me we couldn't have used that as a science teacher? It's there. So a lot of what I want to ask you all to think about when it comes to issues of trauma and struggle and sacrifice and poverty, I want you to think about this. I once got introduced on Scott Barry Kaufman's psychology podcast, and he introduced like, Colin grew up on the rough streets of Brooklyn, New York, and his dad is incarcerated for selling drugs, and he's in poverty on the free and reduced lunch, but welcome, Colin, to the show. And I was like, yeah, I'm glad to be here. Also, please don't ever do that again. I don't want anybody to believe that I had this painful, tragic life. When I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with like up to 9 people, it was the time of my life. Every day was a family gathering. Every single day. I loved it. It was amazing. Best time of my life, hands down. Because, not despite. Because I would see my mom negotiate with the landlord, figure out a way to like get extensions on certain bills. I learned how to negotiate. It was kind of helpful as a lawyer. It's kind of helpful having my own company. So when I start thinking about because, not despite, we've got to start seeing the magic our kids bring to the table. We got to quantify that. For those of you that are in districts that are still using one metric only, I hope it's none, right? But in case you're using a district that's only using one metric only to figure out whether or not kids are gifted, do me a favor. Like really, really start to think about the because, not despite narratives going on. Carrie has a really important comment here. We talk about grit and stamina all the time for kids, but do we realize that as educators, we gotta really make sure that we've got that grit and we've got that stamina? Love that comment. And I wanna be real with you all. A lot of you all are sitting around or you're waiting for a plan or you just heard a plan or you're on some task force. And I'm like, you know what? Why not? Why not racial justice? But an integrated approach to racial justice that understands that academic success must be a part of it. So again, here's the information. Next week at 2 p.m. we're going to be doing this. I've got some time for Q&A now. If you text Think to 66866 and put in your email, you can get there. And again, please do follow along on Twitter, Instagram, and keep in touch. I will take questions that we have. I got a question. I worry about the curriculum I'm giving. I'm throwing a lot of it out. I want to make sure that I get resources that are rich in the intellectual history of Black America. Can you recommend any? So one thing that I want to point out is that it's sometimes in GT, you're in a space where you got a lot more flexibility, or you're not, right? You're in a space where you have a very kind of scripted curriculum, or you're very kind of like narrow in terms of what you can do, especially if we end up in a distance learning space where the options are even more limited. What I want to suggest is this. Black history is American history. In Arizona, like, and really everywhere, like Native history is Arizona history. Like, it's impossible to separate these things. So what I like to think about is our job is to teach our kids how to make a claim, how to analyze different perspectives, how to back up these things with evidence. Like, I need to make sure that my kids understand things. So if we're reading, if we're doing something in US history about 1776, I want to have a conversation around whether or not 1776 should be the day that we celebrate independence, or Nicole Hannah-Jones argues that 1619 is really the day that we should start really tracking the United States as we know it, when the first shipment of enslaved people arrived. So we start realizing there's a lot of conversations that are here. For those of you that teach history or whatever have you, how many of you have taught about the Louisiana Purchase? Just an example. How many of you have taught about the Louisiana Purchase? Just say yes if you have. Louisiana Purchase, anybody? Anybody teaches that? All right. So we teach this, right? And I remember going to all these classrooms, because a lot of social studies teachers use the ThinkLaw curriculum. And they're doing this thing and they kind of talk about it as like, oh yeah, it's kind of crazy. You got this deal and it's a crazy deal. Should they take this deal? It's too good to be true. How many of y'all more or less, that's kind of how you like look at it and you're kind of analyzing the deal and all this stuff and like whatever. And It took until college for me to be an African American studies minor to understand that the reason Napoleon was so hyped to get rid of all that land was because of Haiti and because of the insurrection that was happening there. And here's the thing, as a Caribbean kid, as a kid that grew up in a Caribbean family, we were taught as Caribbean people to look down and scorn and talk nonsense and really negative things and mess up things about Haitian people. Like Haitian people, they're savages, they're wild, they're dirty, they're reckless. Where does that come from? They were the first enslaved people in that whole era to liberate themselves. And the bleeding was so bad that Napoleon said, you know what? We got to roll. We can't even be here anymore. Why didn't I learn that in school? K-12. So this is kind of the opportunities that I'm talking about. So it's not necessarily about like purchasing the resources. It's the idea that it's 2020 and there's a lot of information out there that can supplement and give more breadth to those resources. Jenny, there's also a really good article that was done last year that showed a California and a Texas textbook by the same company and showed in that same textbook in California and Texas, they taught things differently. They spoke about historical events very differently. So like the textbook is a good starting point, but always understand that you got to figure out a way to wrap in other resources. Add to. There we go. What else do we have? Any other questions, comments? So somebody dropped a question here in the comment box. How do you suggest teachers work with admin that do not have buy-in with GT programming in the building? So here's what I say. Like anything else, like it's a hustle, right? You got to gain relationships. You got to learn how to play the game. Why don't most admins rock with like GT programming and GT teachers? There's like a feeling, and I know enough GT teachers to know this isn't actually true, but there is a feeling sometimes that, oh, that person thinks they all that because they're teaching the gifted kids. And they also think that you have the easier job. They don't know what the hell they're talking about, but they think you have an easy job because you're teaching the gifted kids. So I think that like you got to figure out how can I be part of the solution. And what I always recommend, if you teach GT, make it your life to be super supportive in partnership with the ELL teachers, the special education teachers. You figure out a way to like recognize that like y'all are all in this together. You strap up next to them, you speak out for their issues, you support them where it's needed. Because guess what? Those are our kids too. Those are our kids that are constantly under-identified. So like, let's make sure that like, if we want to be able to get the admin to be bought in more, that we buy in more. Some of these departments, and I don't know what district you're talking about, but some departments, it's a whole funky thing altogether because the gifted teacher reports to the gifted coordinator who's not a part of that building. And that's a whole funky thing. If that's your role, you need to go even more in on the idea of like building those strong connections in your school building because you're resented by design. So you got to figure out a way to kind of like change that a little bit different. And I should add, like, I was identified gifted at 7 years old. I was identified with ADHD at 37 years old. Like, there's a lot of kids that we're missing out on. There's a lot of kids that are being underserved in every way you could imagine it. Part of like, I think a good way to kind of like close this discussion would be to say, if you do anything as you plan for this year, I want you to do this. I want you to think about any statement y'all have around like your mission statement, your vision statement, your district strategic plan, whatever you guys have in your hallway or in your little teacher PDs about what you're gonna do for all kids. I'm gonna tell you something. All kids, that's not gonna do it. All kids, there's a guaranteed way to like not pay attention to the individual needs of students. Let's make this transition from all kids to each child. Let's obsess over the eachness of our children and make sure that as a moment of equity at a time where we need critical thinkers more than ever, that we are able to present a very persuasive case as to why equity requires truly meeting the need of each child, which includes kids who are gifted and also includes kids who are gifted and. Because we are really having a hard time with gifted and kids. And I'm gonna tell you what, I'm sick of seeing gifted and kids in juvenile detention centers. So with that, thank you all. I'm really, really glad that we had stopped. We had the conversation around we're no longer leaving genius on the table. Those of you that want, our book is available on Amazon. For those of you that are looking to buy the book in bulk, you can do that from our website at ThinkLaw US. And again, please do check out my book signing event that I have next week. If you text Think to 66866, you'll get a link to that. And anyone that does that, I'll also make sure I circle back with you and give you a handout of this presentation sometime next week as well.
Thank you, Colin. That was a lot of great information. It looks like we're getting a lot of great feedback in the chat here. And I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. With technology working the way it's supposed to, you should automatically get a survey that populates at the end of this webinar. If not, you can just go to AAGT Informs episode 1 to fill out. And for those of you that need professional development or gifted endorsement certificates, that's how you will actually get your certificates, by filling out that form real quick. So that way I can automatically send those over to you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Colin. You are awesome. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
And I hope everybody has a great evening and has a wonderful 4th of July. And we will see you next week. Thank you.